Ponytails. Read by Scribbler. What's Left by DegeTheMighty. Shining's eyes shot open, the cold, bright night swallowing his vision. He shivered, the only warmth coming from the filly tucked up beside him. His hoof wiped his face of sleep's powder, his mind reeling from the transition into reality. His dream was disturbing, but hardly surprising. His head reunited with the ground, his breath shallow and weary, as he tried desperately to return to the land of the dreaming. Maybe he would see her happy this time, see her smile once again. Slumber refused to return, and Shining groaned. Carefully, he rose to his hooves, wishing not to disturb his friend. He shed his blanket and wrapped it around the filly, keeping her warm. His eyes turned toward the moon hanging in the sky, thanking it for its continued presence.
Good to know you're alive somewhere,
he mused, as his gaze turned toward the illuminated valley before him. The past years had done numbers to the land. Before him lay the remnants of Ponyville, the town where his sister used to reside, its dilapidated buildings and ruins a sign of the absence of life. They would continue their trek into the town in the morning, but for now they needed to rest. The stallion let loose a sigh of resignation as he cantered towards their saddlebags. His magic grasped an all-too-familiar bottle as he sat himself down next to the bags. It was the most filled bottle of whiskey they could find, and he was very pleased at its discovery. As he released the cap, he looked at the liquid inside, mourning its purpose. He began to take a hefty draught, one for each life that was lost. One for his wife. The liquid burned a pleasurable sting as it cascaded down his throat in a fiery slither. His throat ached as he readied for another. The sight of her body rushed through his mind, and it burned worse than the alcohol. His cadence reduced to such a defiled sight. Her sincerity, compassion, and love were lost on her killers. So Shining gave them his wrath and vengeance instead. His coat had never been more stained in his life. One for his sister. The second one was easier, as much as he hated to admit it. He was getting used to it by then, and it crushed his soul just thinking about it. At least the alcohol went down easily. At least Twilight had a choice. She had laid down her life to protect those she knew no longer than a month. She was a martyr, and he hated her for it. After Cadence had passed, Twilight was his only support. Now he had nothing left. Except for this young filly. She was what was left. Young, inexperienced and hopeful, she was on the verge of becoming a mare, and that alone made her a target. A disgusting hunt he knew all too well. Those deviants that had taken his wife had died in the most painful way Shining could devise, and he would do it again for this pony. Apple Bloom was her name. A simple earth pony, and a smart one at that. They had spent the past year together, searching for whatever remained of her family, primarily her siblings. He was convinced the search was hopeless, but had failed to convince her. Without a place to really call home, Shining offered to help the filly on her way, as she wouldn't make it far on her own. He had seen the worst of what his kind had to offer over the years, and he grew to despise any other form of life that wasn't the filly he protected. The days were long, the nights cold, and his will had been drained dry a long time ago. Were it not for Apple Bloom, Shining Armour might have joined his family years ago. The stallion returned his gaze to the bottle, readying himself for another mournful drink, when his neck tightened. The strange, numbing sensation started as he felt a slight vibration on the left half of his horn. He quickly raced over to the filly, shaking her awake with one hoof.
Apple Bloom, up, now,
he ordered, unsheathing a series of blades from their cargo. The filly stirred awake, oblivious to the danger. What is it, Shining?
Something or someone's tripped a ward. We gotta go. Quietly.
Shining gave Apple Bloom her knife as he packed up as fast as he could. The filly tiredly rose. Shining shot his gaze to the west. The vibration hadn't shifted position, but it was stronger. Whatever activated his sentries was heading straight for them, and fast. Shining Armour quickly shoved their saddlebags on and began leading Apple Bloom away. A sudden shock blasted through his skull. It was here. Everything happened in a blur. The air was knocked out of Shining's lungs as something slammed him against a boulder. He bucked it off him, brandishing his knife. A creature of silky black and teal, its carapace all too familiar and hated by the unicorn. The changeling's horn lit up, the sickly green aura attempting to bash at him with primal intent. Shining's defences fended it off as he charged the beast. Slashing across its chest, the beast screamed in agony. It continued its magical onslaught, occasionally using its horn as a spear. Shining was exhausted, and his motions were clumsy and dull. Narrowly avoiding a number of attacks, he managed to stab the monster in its shoulder, before a reactionary kick knocked him to the ground. It reared up, before getting knocked to the ground itself by a charging Apple Bloom. She pinned it to the ground, but the beast was much too strong for her. It tossed her off and against a wall. Its hooves held hers in place, as it roared its call, fangs ready to bite. One swift kick knocked it away from her, and Shining stood between the changeling and his charge. It rushed him, horn lowered. Shining mimicked its actions, and the two locked heads. Shining fought against the strength of the beast, as its horn lit once more. A sharp needle pierced his neck, and he withdrew, screaming as blood leaked from the wound. The changeling was quick to react. Its jagged horn found its mark. His cry could be heard for miles as his magic took over. Grabbing the knife, he stabbed at the beast, now lodged in his torso, over and over, as the knife became soaked in blood. One final swipe of the blade cut the horn free from its head, freeing Shining from its custody. He dropped the knife, falling backwards against the wall. Apple Bloom stabbed the carcass repeatedly, confirming its death, before she saw the severity of Shining's injury. "Oh, Celestine, no! Shining!" she shouted, rushing to his aid.
Quick!
He said, his voice strained and barely audible.
The bags. Get the cloth and whiskey.
Apple Bloom felt tears in her eyes, before nodding and retrieving the requested items. She had done this routine countless times. Disinfect as much as possible and bandage. But with a wound like this, she knew it may not be enough. She gave him the items. He poured over half of the bottle of alcohol into the wound.
Yeah.
The burn was worse than fire. He strained to sit upright, trying his best to apply whatever medical magic he knew as he wrapped the cloths around the length of his shoulders. He was losing blood fast. "Shining, come on! We gotta get you help! We gotta find some pony!" she started, tears becoming visible in her eyes.
And just where the hell are we gonna find help, huh?
Shining asked, already drinking out of the bottle.
Ponyville is just as dead as the rest of Equestria, Bloom.
No, it's not. There's ponies down there. I know it. Please, Shining, we gotta hurry.
It's not gonna happen like that, Bloom.
Then Then I'll carry you. Oh! She cried, desperately trying to think of solutions. Her tears dripped upon the soil along with his blood. Apple Bloom sobbed as she buried her face in his chest. Please, Shining, don't! He stroked her mane, trying his best to hide his pain.
Don't worry, Apple Bloom. I just need rest. Some medical magic overnight and I'll be able to walk again in the morning. I'll be fine.
The filly wiped her face, looking at him with hope in her eyes. You promise? He grinned, painfully.
You know I don't make promises, Bloom.
Promise me! She demanded, the agony in her eyes seeming worse than his own. He shook his head.
Fine. I promise.
Apple Bloom smiled at him before another sob broke through. She rested her head as she calmed her breathing. Shining continued trying to console her, assuring her that everything was fine. He would be better with some rest, and they could continue on their way, evade yet another one of death's traps in this hell their world had become. Apple Bloom sighed in relief as she felt the gentle hum of his magic stroking her mane. He was all she had left, and he would be fine. The morning came too soon. Apple Bloom groaned as she opened her eyes. The sunlight blinded her as her vision adjusted to the bright light. The first thing that came into focus were two distant figures, seemingly lost. She grew anxious as she tried to nudge her protector awake. He would not rouse from his sleep easily. Shining, hey, we got some ponies in the distance, she stated, trying to shake him awake, her tone cautious. No response came. Shining? She shook him again. His closed eyes were unwavering. She noticed one of the figures point in her direction and begin to gallop. Come on, Shining! Shining, wake up! This is serious! Yet there was no reply. Not even the slightest movement came from him. Apple Bloom placed her hoof to shake him once more, worried. She withdrew her hoof, before quickly placing her head against his chest. No heartbeat met her ears, and he was cold. She sat back in disbelief, looking at him in shock. She couldn't even hear the approaching hooves, as tears fell down her face. Shining! Shining, no! She looked at his face. His eyes, closed in the most peaceful sleep that was uncharacteristic of him. He was even smiling a little. Please, no! No! Apple Bloom pushed at him, helplessly trying to coax some sort of movement. She only caused his body to fall over onto its side. Her breathing became laboured with approaching terror. She bashed her hoof against his idle chest. The feeling of a pony's coat, but lacking the warmth or the rhythm of a heartbeat, disturbed her immensely. It was wrong. She prayed to Celestia that she was dreaming, that whatever twisted nightmare this was, she would wake up and find him right as rain. He would get up and protect her from whatever ponies were heading towards them. She closed her eyes and focused through her tears, trying with all her might to wake herself from a slumber she wasn't having. Again and again she tried, but to no avail. She opened her eyes, and only his body met her gaze. Her worst fears solidified into a terrible reality. You promised me! You said you'd be alright! You said it'd be alright! She pounded away at his torso. You promised me! Her tears stained his coat as they fell until the sound of hooves stopped behind her. She continued her sobs, refusing to be interrupted by whoever was here. A small gasp came from the pony behind her. Contempt and rage built up within Apple Bloom, ready to lash out at whoever had tried to interrupt her grief. Until she turned and saw the mare's face.
Apple Bloom?
The visitor spoke, in a voice shaken with disbelief. The filly's voice, drenched in grief and shock, mirrored her sister's.
Applejack?
That was What's Left. It was written by DegeTheMighty and read by Scribbler with special guest voice actor Goombasa. Okay, thank you for listening. Those who are looking at the screen when we fixed play, those who aren't just listening to them, will have noticed there was a very special dedication at the end of this one. Today would have been my grandfather's 91st birthday. This is where I start getting a bit maudlin, so those who don't want to listen, don't listen. He was called my Gaga, because when I was very, very little, I couldn't say Grandpa. I used to say Gagam, so he became Gaga. And he was a great rock in my life for a great many years. I grew up quite poor, and my grandparents were big features of my life, even though they lived, and my grandmother still does live, 70 miles away. And when I was growing up, we would travel up to see him and my nana, and we would spend weekends there sometimes when we could afford the petrol, or they would come down and see us, and we would take all of our dogs out together. And I grew up knowing a great deal of love because of them and because of him. But in 2007, he unfortunately, on a routine trip to hospital, contracted C. diffidus and died 3 days later in my arms. And I miss him very, very much. And I always have. And I'm starting to get a bit teary-eyed now. It's been a long time, and the wound is still in the process of scabbing over. That I lost him too soon, and for such a stupid reason. And for the last 3 days of his life, I was there. I was in the hospital room with him, watching him deteriorate. And because of that, I would say to people who are faced with a choice like that, to think very, very carefully about whether you want to be there at the end. Because by the end, he wasn't my Gargam anymore. He was still there, but he wasn't the same at the end. And I am still to this day glad that I stayed for those 3 days, that I didn't leave my mum to cope on her own, watching her dad die. But the memories that are in my head now are mixed together with the ones I remember from when I was very young, when he used to tell me fairy stories, his own particular brand of fairy stories. I don't think anybody else has ever heard the version of Red Riding Hood where John Wayne turns up to shoot the wolf. But he used to tell me all these different things, that he mixed spaghetti westerns with fairy tales and all sorts of other things. And he was from Liverpool, and he had this wonderful Liverpudlian accent. And you've never heard Red Riding Hood told quite the same way, as she carted her bag of potatoes off to her grandmother and John Wayne met her on the bus. And it sounds completely bizarre, but I loved it. I loved it so much. And it was from him that I got my love of storytelling. Because I remember him telling me those silly, silly stories and making me laugh so much, and I loved it. And I loved him. And I am always going to miss him. So it seemed right that today would have been his birthday. And I've had this fic, What's Left. Gumbasa recorded these lines for me early last year. I've had this fic for a very long time. But now seemed like the time to edit it and put it out. Because Shining Armour gave up everything to look after Apple Bloom and to make sure she was okay. And even at the end, he was making sure she was comforted. Even though he knew he was dying. And before he became insensate, and before he couldn't respond to me anymore, that's what my Gargam did. So, after that piece of maudlin stuff, we're going to have to leave it there. But the last thought I will leave people with is, if you have family and you love them, never give up an opportunity to tell them that you love them. Because you don't know how many opportunities you will have left. And it seems a very depressing thing to say. But you can't count on people being there forever, even if they're young. My sister's friend around this time of year, she had just had a baby, and she and her partner were getting ready to start their new life together. And he was hit by a bus and died. You can't tell how long you have left with people. So tell them. Tell them what you feel. Make sure that if you love them, you let them know that. Never leave them in any doubt. Because I never had any doubt that my Gargam loved me, and I hope that he never had any doubt that I loved him. But I wish every day that I had more opportunities to tell him that. Happy birthday, Gargam. Be lovely to each other, and good night, everybody.